present the quietly and gently spoken Joe Tyrell, cardiologist, explorer, mountaineer, and philosopher, who knows his way into a femoral artery, if not all the arteries of the heart. Certainly, he's given me 23 years, and thank you very much. I could say that publicly. I'm enormously grateful, as I'm sure many other people are. Joe, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Some thanks of my own, quickly, if you don't mind. First of all, thanks to Pete for leaving this for me. If you'll excuse me halfway through, I'll need to have a short break. Thank you particularly to Jake and Irv and Bernie and Alistair. I think they've done a wonderful job. So thanks from me to all of them. And then finally, thank you to all of you, because I dropped into your class at the beginning of 5th year, having bailed out the previous year. And you welcomed me, and I've always been proud to be a member of the class of 72. So thank you very much to all of you. And thanks finally to the university for letting us have this function, because I think it's actually wonderful. And it really, I like Jake's idea of a pilgrimage. It is in many ways a pilgrimage for all of us. So thank you. Now, let me say a few words in praise of skepticism. But first, let me apologize for the fact that I'm going to use quite a lot of quotations, because they can be very useful in any talk like this. So, for example, a facility for quotation covers the absence of original thought. So, many good reasons to use quotations. Most of them are from the internet, so please also remember what Abraham Lincoln once said. He said, "The thing about quotes from the internet is that one must be skeptical about their authenticity." So most of us don't remember very well anything in particular that was taught to us by any particular teacher. In fact, it's a miracle that we do remember anything at all. But I do remember one thing that I was taught by Prof. Stuart Saunders, who is a brilliant professor of medicine, and he was also an outstanding Vice-Chancellor of the university. And he taught me the value of a healthy skepticism. And many other fine minds have recognized the value of a healthy skepticism. So let's go right back to Socrates, who was probably the first skeptic, and who famously first claimed that the only true wisdom is in knowing that you know nothing. So if you are skeptical about the aphorisms of Socrates, as you should be, you will recognize the logical fallacy in this little quotation. After all, if you know that you know nothing, then you do know something, even though it's only that you know nothing. But that is a topic for another day. So here are some, it reminds me of Manuel. Many of you will remember Manuel, the Spanish porter, the Spanish waiter from Barcelona in Fawlty Towers, and he famously used to say, "I know nothing." And he would probably have been regarded as Socrates as a very knowledgeable, wise man. Anyways, here are some other fine minds who have recognized the value of skepticism. This is Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a disciple of Darwin's, and he said, "Skepticism is the highest duty, and blind faith the one unpardonable sin." Then there was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course is much better known as a novelist, and who featured the character of Sherlock Holmes. And he said, "A healthy skepticism is the basis of all accurate observation." And then finally, a Canadian academic called David Suzuki said, "Education has failed in a very serious way to convey the most important lesson that science can teach: a healthy skepticism. So very briefly, skepticism falls within the branch of philosophy called epistemology. You can see there are truths without beliefs and there are beliefs without truths, but where they meet, there you may find a measure of wisdom. And epistemology is basically about things like, how do we know what we know? The word comes from the Greek word skeptikismos, and it all has to do with claims about the limitations of human knowledge. So everyday skepticism is an attitude of systematic doubt or incredulity, an attitude that is local, something that concerns you personally, whereas philosophical skepticism concerns claims about the global limitations of human knowledge. So you may get religious skepticism, scientific skepticism, and professional skepticism. But of course we should also say at the outset that sometimes skepticism goes much too far, as we shall see. For example, my wife tells me that I'm a skeptic, but I don't believe a word she says. There are some wonderful local stories about excessive skepticism. So, for example, here is a guy called Joshua Slocum, who was the first man to sail around the world single-handed, which he did in the years 1895 to 1898. And when he came to Cape Town, he paused for a while and was invited to go up into the Transvaal, as it was then, to meet President Kruger. And so he did. And this is what he wrote about it afterwards. He said, "His Excellency received me cordially enough, but my friend Judge Bayers, by mentioning that I was on a voyage around the world, unwittingly gave great offence to the venerable statesman, which we both regretted deeply. Mr. Kruger corrected the judge rather sharply, reminding him that the world is flat. 'You don't mean around the world,' said the president. 'It is impossible. You mean in the world,' he said. And not another word did he say, either to the judge or to me." Of course, we can forgive President Kruger because of the priceless asset that he left us, the Kruger National Park. It's not so easy to forgive President Mbeki, as he was then, who was an AIDS denialist, an error which in South Africa has been blamed for the preventative deaths from AIDS of approximately 350,000 people. In 2016, Thabo Mbeki was still an AIDS denialist. He not only denied that AIDS is caused by a virus, the HIV virus, he even denied having denied that the virus causes AIDS. And then there are all kinds of other denialisms, the cholesterol denialism, the Holocaust denialism, and so on. The cholesterol denialism is particularly painful for me because, of course, we deal every day with coronary heart disease, which is to a large extent caused by cholesterol. So here is a statement from the European Society of Cardiology, published in the European Heart Journal. Low-density lipoproteins cause atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and this is evidence from genetic, epidemiologic, and clinical studies. And here's a consensus statement from these world experts, and they say, consistent evidence from numerous and multiple different types of clinical and genetic studies unequivocally establish that LDL cholesterol causes atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Now, you would think that that was fairly straightforward and convincing. Not for some people. The evidence is overwhelming, but there are still some people who deny it. The evidence meets all the criteria for causality, plausibility, strength, biological gradient, and so on and so on and so forth. In fact, the evidence is so powerful that we no longer need to refer to the cholesterol hypothesis, we could just refer to the cholesterol axiom. It is axiomatic. Here's another example, climate change denialism, a meeting of the climate change deniers of America as their bungalows floats away in the floods. Here's a statement from the 4th National Climate Assessment in the United States, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Without substantial and sustained global mitigation and regional adaptation efforts, climate change is expected to cause growing losses to American infrastructure and property and to impede the rate of economic growth over the century. And then finally, did the moon landings ever occur? It's amazing that public opinion polls in the States in 1994 and again in 2001 found that 6 to 9% of Americans did not believe that America landed on the moon in 1968 or whenever it was. And in the UK and in Russia and in other similar places, the percentage was considerably higher. Moon landings denialists. Here is one small hoax from man and one giant lie for mankind. So here's another fascinating bit of statistics. This is now the response in 18 different countries to the statement, human beings as we know them developed from earlier species of animals. And you can see on the left here the Scandinavian countries, where in blue they accept that this is a true statement. So you can see that in general, at least 80% of the population of these Scandinavian countries accept that statement. But if you look at the other side of the slide, in the United States, only 40% accept that we, as humans, developed from earlier species of animals. As Bertrand Russell used to say, we must be skeptical even of our own skepticism. The other side of hyper-skepticism, if you like, is gullibility and credulity, the tendency to believe things for which there is little or no evidence. So here's some more examples. Cults, astrology, advertising, Trojan horse, superstitions, pyramid schemes, political manifestos, and complementary medicine. Now, I don't want to say much about complementary medicine, so let us move on to what Bertrand Russell had to say on the same topic. Man is a credulous animal and must believe something. In the absence of good grounds for belief, he will be satisfied with bad ideas. And Denis Diderot, who's a French philosopher, wrote, "We swallow greedily the lie that flatters us, but we sip only little by little at a truth we find bitter." Here's a little bit about complementary medicine. All I should say is that it should be subjected to the same rigorous scrutiny as any other branch of medicine. And I don't have it with me at this moment, but there's a very good book you might like to read called Trick or Treatment, which is a dissertation on complementary medicine, written, interestingly enough, by Simon Singh, who's a science journalist, and Edzard Ernst, who's a professor of complementary medicine. So what is the path to knowledge? Well, Daniel Boorstin was the Librarian of Congress, and he wrote, "The greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge." And Denis Diderot wrote in his turn, "Scepticism is the first step towards truth." So it's fascinating. Here, this is sentiment about the heart in the late 19th century. A chap called Theodore Billroth, of surgical fame, wrote, "A surgeon who tries to suture a heart wound deserves to lose the esteem of his colleagues. This is all about the untouchable heart. And then a chap called Stephen Paget writes, surgery of the heart has probably reached the limits set by nature to all surgery. No method, no new discovery can overcome the natural difficulties that attend a wound of the heart. That was in 1896. Only about 35 years later, a chap called Werner Forssmann was skeptical about these opinions, and he set out to prove that actually you could touch the heart, you could put things inside the heart, and a patient would not die immediately. What he did was he took a urinary catheter, he gave himself, I think, some local anesthetic in an antecubital vein here. He pushed this urinary catheter into the vein, and then he walked down to the X-ray department and took an X-ray of the catheter as he advanced it into the right atrium. And here is the X-ray taken at the time, soon after he had walked down to the X-ray department. And for this work, simple as it was, he won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1956. Other truths were much more difficult to determine. It's astonishing, for example, that in 2022, we still don't know what constitutes a healthy diet. But anyway, these difficulties led to the modern era of clinical trials. In the mid-18th century, long-sea voyages were ravaged by scurvy affecting the crews of the ships. And this led to the very first clinical trial, which interestingly was conducted at sea in 1747 aboard a Royal Naval ship by the name of HMS Salisbury. And the trial was extremely basic. Dr. Lind took 12 patients and he divided them into 6 groups, each containing 2 patients. And then he gave them, each group, slightly different treatment. The first group had a quart of cider daily. The second group, 2 spoons of vinegar 3 times a day. The third group, 12 guts of elixir of vitriol, whatever that may be. And so it went on. And the only group that got anything of any value was the fourth group, who received 2 oranges and 1 lemon every day. What was the result? Well, the most sudden and visible good effects were from the use of the oranges and lemons, one of those who had taken them being at the end of 6 days fit for duty. And the other was the best recovered of any in his condition, and being now deemed pretty well, was appointed nurse to the rest of the sick. So it was a trial that was flawed in every way you could think of, and yet it produced results. The other problem in those days was bloodletting, or therapeutic phlebotomy, as it was technically called. And it was, interestingly, it was one of the commonest medical practices performed by surgeons from antiquity until the late 19th century, a span of almost 2,000 years. Bloodletting was used to treat almost every disease. One British medical text recommended bloodletting for acne, asthma, cancer, cholera, coma, convulsions, diabetes, epilepsy, gangrene, gout, herpes, indigestion, insanity, jaundice, leprosy, ophthalmia, plague, pneumonia, scurvy, smallpox, stroke, tetanus, tuberculosis, and approximately 100 other diseases. The practice of bloodletting persisted well into the 20th century, even prominent physicians like Sir William Osler supporting it. But here's a fascinating story. 223 years ago to the day, George Washington, the President of the United States, developed what sounds like a viral illness. It sounds like he had tracheobronchitis. But he wasn't better by the next day, and so his physicians got to work and they started doing some bloodletting, and they took off 3 liters of blood in the space of 24 hours. That very same day, George Washington died, almost certainly of hypovolemic shock. Now, in the meantime, one of the chief proponents of bloodletting in the United States was a chap called Benjamin Rush. He was a much respected New England physician who had taught an entire generation of students about the benefits of bloodletting, including the 3 doctors who had just recently treated George Washington. But an English journalist by the name of William Cobbett became skeptical about the benefits of bloodletting, and he declared that Rush's methods had, quote, contributed to the depopulation of the earth. So Rush responded by suing Corbett for libel in Philadelphia in 1797. The case dragged on for 2 years. There were 7 lawyers, but only 3 witnesses. And eventually, on the 14th of December 1799, the very day that George Washington died, the court found in favor of Rush and in favor of bloodletting and ordered Corbett to pay him damages of $5,000. So here is a lovely irony: George Washington dying of hypovolemic shock on the very day that a court approved it as a reasonable treatment. And so the court, having approved bloodletting, the practice continued. And it continued for at least another 17 years until, in the Peninsular War of 1816, a Scottish surgeon by the name of Alexander Hamilton randomized 366 patients to one of 3 groups. One group used bloodletting and 2 others did not. So there were 3 groups, about 122 in each group, and these are the results. The mortality in groups 1 and 2, where there was no bloodletting, ranged from 2 to 4, or from 1.6 to 3.2%. And group 3, which was where bloodletting was practiced, the mortality was 28%. So this caused some difficulties in the field of medical education. But and then along came Sir William Osler, one of the most famous physicians of his time, and a physician who I revere. But this is what he said to his students on one memorable day. By the way, there were no women in the classes of those days. This was a class entirely of men. And he said to them, "Gentlemen, I have a confession to make. Half of what we have taught you is in error. And furthermore, we cannot tell you which half it is." Anyway, so this led to the era of evidence-based medicine, and I'm not going to go through this in any detail. It led to things like the Cochrane collaboration and to the publications of guidelines. Here is Archie Cochrane, who created the Cochrane Library and the Cochrane Center, and you're all familiar with the format of recommendations and evidence and so on, guiding clinical practice. Here I've assembled some guidelines for surgeons, the ECG for surgeons, and here we are. So I knew we had a strong surgical contingent today, and I thought it'd be quite a good opportunity to give them some education. Can you all read it? Yeah. It is fascinating to see how sometimes treatments shift radically from one extreme to the other. This, for example, is a well-known example in cardiology. When I was a junior cardiologist, it would have been heretical to give a patient in heart failure a beta-blocking drug. But that situation changed gradually, and this is now an editorial of some kind published in the Quarterly Journal of Medicine in 1999, the notion that beta blockers may confer substantial prognostic benefits in chronic heart failure will seem counterintuitive and even inconceivable to generations of clinicians brought up with the strict doctrine that these agents are harmful to patients with impaired ventricular function. Nevertheless, a compelling weight of evidence now supports such a radical and unprecedented U-turn in clinical practice. So now, if you did not give patients with heart failure a beta blocker, you might well be accused of malpractice. A little bit about medical fraud. Arnold Relman was the editor of the New England Journal for a number of years, and this is what he wrote about the possibility of medical fraud. Science is at once the most questioning and skeptical of activities and the most trusting. It is intensely skeptical about the possibility of error, but it is totally trusting about the possibility of fraud. And yet, surveys have shown that approximately 2% of scientists will admit to falsifying data at least once. This will be a well-known story to most of you, the claim in 1998 that MMR vaccination was linked to autism. Well, that contention was subsequently proved many times, but it took 12 years for that article to be retracted in the Lancet. And in the meantime, the vaccination figures for using MMR vaccine had declined drastically in the UK and in Ireland, leading to completely unnecessary illness and even death. So there's the retraction. And then some fascinating modern non-medical hoaxes. I've left out the Piltdown hoax, which is pretty straightforward, but there are two fascinating other hoaxes. This is a chap called Alan Sokal, who is a professor of mathematics at University College London, and he's a professor of physics at New York University. And in 1996, he set out to see whether a leading North American journal of cultural studies would publish an article liberally salted with nonsense if A, it sounded good, and B, if it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions. So he published an article, a deliberately nonsensical article, which he submitted to a journal of postmodern cultural studies called Social Text, published, they're embarrassed to admit, by Duke University. And to his delight, this article was published without peer review, and this is what he called it: transgressing the boundaries towards a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity. He said, because scientific research is inherently theory-laden and self-referential, it cannot assert a privileged epistemological status with respect to counter-hegemonic narratives emanating from dissident or marginalized communities. Physical reality is at bottom a social and linguistic construct. And then he put at the bottom, in brackets, anybody who believes that the laws of physics are mere social conventions is invited to try transgressing those conventions from the windows of my apartment on the 21st floor. And here's the other wonderful article. This is now entitled, The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. It's an article of 3,000 words submitted to a peer-reviewed journal called Cogent Social Scientists and published in May 2017. Again, the idea was to see whether an academic journal would publish nonsense if the paper seemed to support a particular ideological point of view. So this is the first statement from these two authors. The androcentric scientific and meta-scientific evidence that the penis is the male reproductive organ is considered overwhelming and largely uncontroversial. And it goes on, we conclude that penises are best understood as an enacted social construct that is damaging and problematic for society. The conceptual penis presents significant problems for gender identity, is exclusionary to disenfranchised communities, is an enduring source of abuse for women and other gender marginalized groups and individuals, and is the conceptual and this is most important, and is the conceptual driver behind much of climate change. So finally, fake news, in which Donald Trump features prominently. For him, it's not the news that is untrue, it's just news that is negative or inconvenient for Donald Trump. This is the godfather of skepticism. It's a chap called Michael Shermer, who created a journal called Skeptic Magazine, which he still publishes. He teaches a course called Scepticism 101, and he owns two dogs, one called Darwin and the other one called Hitch, in memory of Christopher Hitchens. But perhaps the most sober voice, and the one to which we should listen, was the voice of Carl Sagan, who sadly died at the age of only 62 of myelodysplasia. He was a wonderful cosmologist, and this is what he wrote. What is called for is an exquisite balance between two conflicting needs: the most skeptical scrutiny of all hypotheses that are served up to us, and at the same time, great openness to new ideas. This is how deep truths are winnowed from deep nonsense. For Sir William Osler, one of the greatest physicians of all time, really, the virtues to be valued above all others in doctors were equanimity and imperturbability. But I would like to suggest we should add another virtue, a healthy but open-minded skepticism. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, guys. Pete?
Our next speaker.
Thank you very much.